So moving on. Okay, the bearing retainer, I've just put the bolts in the bearing retainer now on the input shaft to the gearbox. It stops any bearing creep. So yeah, that installed, and obviously we've got the oil pump down here that we did on the last video. So the only thing that's changed is now on the selector drum is the two detents. We have a detent, a screwdriver at this side, just in there, and we have the selector fork. So the first detent runs on this back ring here to locate in its grooves. Next to it, and right next to it, is the selector fork off the gear change shaft. Okay, it runs up through, and then in between fighting and wrestling with these springs that go on there, we have like a little plate that keeps that selector arm behind that plate, keeps it in line with what it's pulling on the little pins at the back here. And obviously the big detent that we can see here now, which is for gear positions, it's just sat in actually in the neutral position there at the minute. So yeah, that's all that's changed. That's where we're at with it. Well, that's all that's been rebuilt since. So we're now ready to start and look at. We've got pistons cleaned. You know, everything's ready for top end, ready for building the top end. But we'll get this side put in first, and we'll get the clutch side, primary drive side put in first, and then we can move forward with that. So I'm going to put this back on its tripod. Bear with me a second. So what do we have? We have the next thing in line on here is how we drive this oil pump. So at the back of the clutch and the primary drive, we have all been washed off in petrol and lightly oiled now. So we just have the spacer that goes on. We have this washer, big washer, that goes on. It actually went that way before. It matters which way around it is. So what we now get is the chain drive to the oil pump. Now there's no tensioner on this chain. It is physically just allowed to sort of whip. But so what we get, it slides on the shaft. Now these four raised pins actually locate. In fact, we'll just have a look at that before we put it on. So with that sprocket like that, okay, that does go up to there. It's too big on there at the minute because that spacer goes in and it sits like that. So, but how it's driven, what we're going to do is we'll just look at the back. Okay, so that locates in the back of there. Okay, so when it's all assembled, we have to ensure that them pins. So, and remember, the primary drive is constant mesh with the crankshaft. So when the engine's running, this is turning, so this is turning, which makes good sense to have the oil pump turning all the time the engine's running. So anyway, we'll go back to this. And I always keep the chain running in the same direction it was running in previously. So there we go. So now we can offer that onto the shaft. Just let that go onto the shaft there, and then this slot we need to just align up with the oil pump. Okay, like so. Now we can lift this. So we've got our washer and our spacer at the back. We can now slide on our, it was actually that way, that matters either. Make sure that that sits behind there and it takes a lot of the. So what I want to do next is just want to put a little bit of Loctite on this retaining bolt for that oil pump sprocket. So I have my tray here stinking of petrol, but it's the old racing days. One of the best ways of cleaning down parts is in petrol. We've got the ferocious little mog that's now growing up. It's eating us out of the house. I know this thing. It's a Norwegian forest cat, and he's I don't know what he's on, but I think he's on steroids or something, because I think it's quadrupled in size in about 4 weeks. But anyway, it's so I'll just get the Loctite. Bear with me. Right, I'm just going to put a nad of Loctite on this bolt. We don't want a lot, but I just want to be sure that that should have me 10 mils and stuff here. Okay. Right, so obviously it's going to turn now as I'm trying to tighten it up. So what I'm going to do with that looks like, does that one go in there? Yeah, that's kind of perfect in there. That's my 8mm socket locking against the body of the oil pump, and all I want to do now, someone's going to say, what torque was that? I don't know, I've been doing this a long time and I know that that's fine for that. She's Loctite in anyway. So we have our oil pump drive on there now, as you can see it, and it's going to be turning, crank turns clockwise, so obviously the meshed gear with it turns anti-clockwise, so it's going to rotate in that in that direction, and there we go. So we're ready for clutch. So moving on with the clutch, get the Loctite out of the way. So I've got the parts again washed out in petrol, and a bit of a light oil just inside the bearing before it goes back, because we don't know how long it is actually going to be before it runs. So some engine oil up onto this little roller bearing in here. Let me give it a little bit more. There we go. So the first thing now, as we said, is we've got to get this to mesh with the drive. So let's give ourselves a reference. Let's put one at the top, and it's at the top. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, that went straight in. So as we can see, it's now turning. When that's turning, it is turning the chain for the oil pump. Okay, so that's in and sorted. Right, I'm going to get the crankshaft primer drive gear sorted, and I don't know if you can, if I take the camera off here, we might be able to see. Should have actually shown that before I put the camera on. Just bear with me a second again. In here, to take that off, would it? Let me just slide that back out. Okay, let it just sit like that for a minute. You know, you see what looks like a misalignment of them teeth. It's actually a gear. It puts, even though spur gears have to have like a degree of clearance or whatever, there's a spring-loaded section of this gear that puts, when it slides back into alignment, it's obviously got a spring-loaded. It's natural that spring is in that position now, but what it wants to do is move slightly back, but it'll keep like a stop the chaff. Okay, so we've got a oil pump drive in the 4 dog pins at the back of there. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to look at what we've got on the back of the crankshaft's driven primary drive. Is this raised part of the crankcase here is the actual thrust washer for the crank, which when this is tightened up against, slides all the way on and tightens up against the crankshaft, there'll be a predetermined limit of end flip, and essentially it just stops it from the crank being able to move in and out. Okay, so the next mission to do, I'm just going to have to put this on the tripod for this, is we have to get this primary drive to engage on the inner. Now I've just slid that in there so that the end of this tooth here is only on the first part, and if you see there's actually 2. I get the small screw on that one, you can see that part of it is spring loaded, and as it says in the manual, you have to lift that with a screwdriver to get this. Basically these two teeth are misaligned, so you need to bring that tooth up to align with the tooth, and then you can carefully just tap the prime drive on. So I'm going to just mount this back on the tripod and we'll have a look. Right, I don't know how close I can get into that to show that one-handed. And so what we're going to do, as just shown, I'm going to lift that tooth, the inner tooth, against its spring, and when it's in, there we go, simple as that. So now what that's done is it's just put, with this having a preload on it now, the two teeth are in line but they're against the spring, so essentially it makes these two spur gears, rather than the helical gear that puts side forces on, these two spur gears now will run quieter. Okay, so the next move could be putting the starter clutch on, which is here. So we have the big washer and the starter clutch, but what I'm going to do with this at the minute, I want to clean all that as well. Okay, so I'm going to put that to one side for the minute and we'll carry on looking at the clutch. So the next move, as I said, everything has now been washed down in petrol. The next move with the clutch, we're engaged, we know our drive, our oil pump drive is engaged, so we know we're not going to, so if you start tightening this up and everything wasn't in its alignment, the pins were in the holes, etc., you could end up with all sorts of problems. So the next move is to look at this clutch. So this clutch, quite a special clutch, I suppose. Yeah, in as much as one of Honda's attempts to use a slipper clutch. As you can see, it's all been cleaned off. Now you can actually see the witness marks inside here of that runs up directly, that machine face runs up directly against the spacer in there, etc. So we're just going to slide that on. There's no kind of right or wrong with that, on it goes. Okay, now this washer, big washer, there's a couple of witness marks on it there, there isn't there, so it's not a spring in any way, so it was that way around, so I'm just going to install it back that way around again. In fact, what I might do, because it can just fall out that drop off, as you can see, just put a bit of engine oil on there, put a film on, it might just help that stay and get it on both. Okay, stops it, yeah, a bit of viscous there, stops it trying to just fall off. So next move is our next section of this clutch. So this is actually the slipper side of the clutch, because that is on that spline, it's fixed and it's on that position. Yes, it's on the main shaft, but it's still fixed. Now what we get with this one, obviously if the engine's rotating clockwise, this gear is rotating at what, something region of what, 3 to 1, 3.5 to 1, something like that ratio between that gear and that gear, but nevertheless anti-clockwise is rotating. So what happens is this is going in that direction, driving in that direction, but what if this inner part, you drop down a gear too soon for the RPM, went down the gears howling into an hairpin corner, and rather than, when you drop the clutch, rather than it pick the engine up to blow up, so we're now, what happens is, even though it's driving this way, if I can do this, if the back wheel drives is going, suddenly starts going quicker than the engine, only when the back wheel's going quicker than the engine do you get a situation where it can freewheel in there. But as soon as we want to drive it, which is this driving that way. So we're driving it that way, it locks that bearing up. It's a lock-up bearing inside it, okay? So while we're driving, it's going to drive that shaft. But if that shaft speeds up quicker than this is going, it can go on its own. Look, it can go that way, but it can't go that way. And that's Honda's lock-up clutch. Okay, so a little bit of oil again in this bearing, because everything has been washed. I'm just going to let that spin a few times, get a little bit of that around there. Okay, just a little bit. Doesn't hurt, it's always in there, isn't it? Okay, so we can now put this side of it in as well. So we maintain that, and obviously when we come to put clutch in, we have to align up those slots. Okay, so that's the second side of that part of that clutch inside. So now we move on to, we've got all our fibre plates all washed off and clean, and we've got all our steel plates just washed off in petrol. Okay, these are not new, they've been used, so they are going to be, I might just get a little bit on my hand and just put a little bit of oil on each face of these plates. It's just to basically stop them overheating the first time you use it. Just allows that bit of slip to start with. Okay, so the first plate's going to go in. We haven't got too much of an indentation in here. I mean, in the days when I had some worn out TZ stuff inside car racing, and this, what used to happen in here, we used to get a situation where the plates would actually bite into this clutch basket, and even though you released the clutch and it lifted the plates from biting together, the situation of the drive forced the clutch plate to drop back into its groove when it's normally compressed, and it was really difficult to change gears. So it's worth thinking about that. Yeah, there is witness marks on there again, but there's nothing really, nothing makes me want to change it. Like I say, it's 16,000 mile this engine. So so right, next plate is a steel plate, the bridge between the two, he says, and I can line them up again. There we go, across the bridge. Next one, another oiled fibre plate. So we now have another steel plate. We need to adjust the line again to get it to go across. That's it. So all good stuff, as they say. So one of the local gangsters just gone past in his 1 litre EcoBoost Fiesta. There we go. So we've noticed now at that point there is now only room for, so we've got 3 of them left and 4 of them left. So now we can go a bit more oil on there. They are impregnated with oil, but if you were to do new clutch plates in here, it's advisable to just give them a little bit of an oil. Okay, so he goes in. And then our next steel. A bit of oil again. Just a bit of a film of oil on, that's all we're looking for at this stage. Okay, another steel. Another fibre. Yes, it's particularly boring, I know, but maybe I should have speeded this bit up. What do I reckon? Let's just get that in there, and then but we don't rush. We're not rushing it. We need to make sure everything goes in right. Okay, last fibre. Yeah, even though they've been cleaned, they are still, you know, the fibre, asbestos, whatever it is, side of the plate is still got an oil film in there. Okay, so our next move, or our next component, is the big washer that sits in there. I just want to give that again a bit of clean oil, just a bit of build oil in there, and keep him sat there. And then we then get the big washer. Okay, now he says I want to just put some oil at the back of that to keep that from moving about. But hang on, let me just get that back out again. Now you can tell again by the witness marks that that's where it came from. That bit of oil just helps keep that there. You know, now he's on there like that, that'll stay. May drop as it did, but it doesn't matter. So the next bit we have for this is the beginning of the pressure plate. So we now align up okay, so he's now aligned. See, that drops down behind there, it wants to create a bit of trouble. So now the spring, this is the only spring to this particular clutch. So we have the spring, okay, the spring goes in there, and catch it on the way past, so to speak, is that goes in there, and all we have left, so as we start to tighten this up, we just have our washer on the back, and then we have the nut, tiny nut, and that nut actually, as we start to tighten this, that nut actually compresses this diaphragm spring. Okay, so what I'm going to do with that, I'm just going to put that there for the minute, stop it all falling off, but we're going to come back and torque that whenever all this is assembled. Okay, when all this is assembled. Right, so moving on, that's how that clutch goes together, and obviously there's a clutch push rod that comes all the way through to a lifter inside here. As a plate goes on with a big circlip. So essentially that's the clutch and the slipper clutch side of it assembled. So starting to look a little bit more, you know, as it should be. So okay, so what we got next? Actually, I want to wash that, as I said. I want to wash this out in petrol first and re-oil it. So I think we'll sign it off at this for the minute while I get that washed off, and probably just get that torqued up. So yeah, we'll pick it up in a minute when this side of the job is done.